Are you deaf or just pretending to be? Judge Henry Whitmore's voice thundered through the courtroom like a storm hitting a church bell. He didn't even bother to lift his eyes from the papers stacked neatly in front of him. His words weren't just sharp, they were designed to cut. Across the room, David Carter stood still. His charcoal suit was spotless, his tie straight, his expression calm. Not a flicker of reaction crossed his face. Whitmore finally looked up, his pale eyes narrowing. "I said sit down," he barked, slamming his gavel so hard the sound bounced off the marble walls. "Maybe you'll learn to respect authority someday." David slowly sat, his spine straight as a ruler, his gaze steady on the man who held his fate. The golden letters DC shimmered faintly on his briefcase beside him. Whitmore smirked. Charges: reckless conduct, disturbing the peace, and resisting arrest. 60 days in county jail. Maybe that'll teach you that this courtroom isn't your playground. A hush fell over the room. The sound of the gavel sealing David's sentence echoed like a gunshot. Have you ever watched someone's entire world collapse? Not in years, but in seconds? What happened in that courtroom would soon shake an entire state's justice system to its core. The kingdom of control Judge Henry. Whitmore had ruled his courtroom for 15 years with the same philosophy: order before compassion. To him, justice was not about truth, and it was about control. He liked things neat, predictable. In his mind, society worked best when people stayed in their place. His colleagues called him disciplined, principled, tough on crime. Over cigars and bourbon at the country club, they praised him for keeping the peace. But peace came at a cost. If you looked closely at the records, you'd see the pattern, though most people were too afraid to say it aloud. When Andre Lewis, a black factory worker, stood before Whitmore for assault, he got 18 months in jail. When Ethan Walker, a white accountant, faced the same charge 3 weeks later, he walked away with probation and community service. Whitmore called it considering background and character. Everyone else called it what it was: discrimination dressed in legal language. He never used slurs. He never yelled racial insults. He didn't have to. He used tone, timing, and the quiet authority of the bench to make sure everyone understood their place. The quiet victims in court, defense lawyers, had learned the rules. If you were white, you could argue. If you were black, you stayed quiet and prayed. When Alicia Turner, a young black attorney, objected during a domestic case, Whitmore cut her down mid-sentence. "Counselor, perhaps you should focus on understanding proper procedure before lecturing this court," he said, voice smooth as ice. 15 minutes later, her white male colleague made the same objection. Whitmore nodded. Sustained. "Thank you, counselor, it wasn't a mistake. It was a message." Case by case, hearing by hearing, Judge Whitmore built a system that punished people not for their crimes, but for their color. Black defendants went to prison. White ones went home. The numbers didn't lie. On average, his black defendants served 40% longer sentences than white defendants for the same crimes. But those statistics lived in quiet whispers, trapped in case files no one dared to touch. And Whitmore, he slept well every night, convinced he was a man of principle. The man who took notes. But one person in his courtroom noticed everything. Maria Lopez. His longtime clerk had spent years recording every word, every ruling, every smirk. She didn't do it out of revenge, and she did it out of survival. Whitmore had a habit of firing anyone who questioned him. So Maria learned to write. Quietly, meticulously, privately. By the time 15 years passed, she had compiled a collection of notes so detailed it could destroy him. Still, no one spoke up. Not the attorneys. Not the clerks. Not the families who feared retaliation. Whitmore was untouchable. The breaking point. That illusion of power began to crack during the Jefferson case. Marcus Jefferson, a 24-year-old college graduate with no record, was caught with a small amount of cocaine. The prosecutor recommended probation and counseling. Nothing unusual. Whitmore leaned forward, glaring down at Marcus. "You had every chance to make something of yourself," he said, his words dripping contempt. "Instead, you chose the path your community knows all too well." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. 2 years in state prison, Whitmore declared. "Maybe that'll teach you discipline." That same week, Chase Miller, a white college student with the same charge, stood in the same courtroom. Whitmore smiled. "Mr. Miller, this was a mistake, not a pattern. 6 months probation, community service, and counseling. 2 men. Same crime, 2 different futures. That's when whispers began to spread. Public defenders started comparing notes. Some even joked darkly, "You'd better pray you don't get Whitmore on your case," but beneath the laughter was fear. Fear of a man who controlled not just verdicts but careers. The judge's world, Whitmore wielded power like a king in a crumbling kingdom. If you challenged him, your motions vanished in paperwork delays. If you questioned him, your client suddenly faced higher bail. If you opposed him, your career quietly died. He ruled through intimidation, not with violence but with bureaucracy. The legal community called it discipline. Those who lived under it called it a dictatorship. By the time he was being considered for promotion to the state appellate court, his reputation was spotless, at least on paper. He celebrated his coming nomination at the city's elite courthouse lounge, raising a glass of aged whiskey. To justice, he toasted, grinning at the irony. But power, as history often proves, has a way of attracting the one person who can tear it all down. That person was David Carter, and in less than 6 months, Judge Henry Whitmore would face the very justice he had twisted for years. David Carter arrived at the state attorney's office on a rainy Tuesday morning. The kind of morning that made even marble hallways feel heavy. Phones rang, heels clicked, papers shuffled. But there was an invisible pulse running through the building. Everyone knew the lead prosecutor had returned early. He moved with quiet precision, his leather briefcase in one hand, his expression unreadable. People greeted him with a mix of respect and curiosity. David wasn't just another attorney. He was the kind who saw details others missed, the kind who remembered every name, every file, every injustice that slipped through cracks no one else wanted to see. He stepped into his office, where charts, folders, and case summaries were already waiting. The air smelled faintly of ink and coffee. On the center of his desk was a file labeled Whitmore H. David's deputy. Sandra Wells poked her head through the door. "Morning, boss. The sentencing data you requested came in last night." "It's extensive." "How extensive?" David asked without looking up. Sandra hesitated. "You're going to want to see it yourself." He opened the folder. Within seconds, the room seemed to shrink. There it was, 15 years of sentencing data broken down by race, crime, and outcome. The pattern wasn't subtle. It screamed from the numbers. In assault cases, black defendants averaged 40% longer sentences. In drug-related charges, 60%. He exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He wasn't just biased, he murmured. He built an entire system around it. His phone buzzed. It was Dr. Evelyn Park, a statistician from the university who had been helping him quietly compile data. "I ran it twice," she said, her voice trembling through the speaker. "It's consistent across every metric. It's not random. It's deliberate, then it's time," David replied. "Prepare everything. No leaks, no noise. We do this clean." He hung up and stared at the photograph on his desk, a framed picture of his younger brother, Michael. The two of them stood on the courthouse steps, smiling, naive enough to believe justice was equal. That was before Michael's arrest last month in Whitmore's district. The police report read, "Aggressive behavior. Failure to comply." The same words David had seen hundreds of times used against men who looked like them. Michael had called him that night, his voice shaking. "He didn't even let me explain, David. He looked at me like I was trash." That night replayed in David's head over and over. And now, looking at the data, he realized it wasn't just his brother. It was hundreds, maybe thousands. Sandra reappeared, holding another file. "You asked for a list of attorneys who've tried cases in Whitmore's court. Tony Brooks tops it. 27 cases, most with black defendants." David nodded. "Get Tony in here." Minutes later, Tony Brooks, a weary defense attorney with graying hair and kind eyes, entered. "I hear you're digging into Whitmore," he said quietly. "Careful, David, he plays politics like chess. You'll lose before you even sit down." David turned the monitor toward him. "Your clients under Whitmore received on average 38% harsher sentences than your white defendants." "Same charges, same backgrounds." Tony went pale. "My God, it's not your fault," David said. "He's been manipulating this for years. But I'm done watching it happen." Tony frowned. "What are you planning?" David leaned back in his chair, the faint hum of the city below vibrating through the glass windows. "Evidence. Hard, undeniable evidence. And for that, I need him to show who he really is in real time. Tony froze. You're not saying, "Oh, I am," David interrupted calmly. I'm going to put myself in front of him. As a defendant, that's insane. You'd be risking your career, your entire life's work. David's voice didn't waver. I've spent 15 years protecting the law. Now I need to protect the people it failed. Tony rubbed his forehead. If you do this, I don't know you. No one does. You'll be on your own. That's the point, David replied. That night, David sat in his home office long after midnight staring at his wall of evidence. Files stacked neatly, color-coded, precise. Each folder represented someone Whitmore had crushed. He picked up one marked Jefferson Marcus and flipped it open. The photo showed a young man with tired eyes and a suit 2 sizes too big. The charge, possession. The sentence, 2 years. Next to it, another file. Miller Chase, same charge, probation. David closed his eyes, gripping the edge of his desk. Not one more, he whispered. His phone lit up with a new message. It was from Judge Laura Thompson, a friend from law school. David, I've been hearing things. Quiet talk about data requests coming from your office. You're poking a hornet's nest. If you're going after Whitmore, be careful. He's protected. David typed back. He won't be for long. Before turning off his lamp, he sent one last encrypted email to Sandra. If anything happens to me Thursday, you take over. The files are under code Iron Lantern. Do not open until confirmed. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed the plan again and again. One mistake and everything would collapse. But if it worked, one of the most powerful men in the state would finally face justice. The next morning, the storm clouds over downtown hadn't lifted. David slipped on his coat, picked up his briefcase, and whispered to himself, sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to walk straight into it. He dialed a number he knew by heart. Officer Daniels? It's David Carter. I need a favor, a very specific one. The line went silent for a moment. You're serious about this? Completely. Then God help you, Daniels muttered. By Friday, David Carter would no longer be a prosecutor. He'd be a defendant. And Judge Henry Whitmore would finally reveal who he truly was. The night before everything unraveled, the city pulsed under a curtain of rain. Streetlights shimmered on wet asphalt like melted gold. And somewhere between those reflections, David Carter made the final adjustments to his plan. Every detail mattered. Timing, jurisdiction, charges, witnesses. A single flaw and it would all crumble before the truth could breathe. He stared at his phone, reading the last message from his brother. You sure this is worth it? David typed back. It's not about me anymore. Across town, Judge Henry Whitmore sat in his private study, surrounded by the quiet hum of classical music and the flicker of a fireplace. On the wall hung a portrait of his father, a former judge, eyes stern and cold as though watching him from another century. Whitmore poured himself a glass of bourbon and smiled faintly at the news article on his tablet. Whitmore likely picked for state appellate bench. He'd spent years crafting this image. Disciplined, incorruptible, the man who kept chaos out of his courtroom. He believed he was the anchor holding society together. He had no idea that the tide was already turning against him. The next morning, a silver sedan rolled through Brookhaven County. Inside, David gripped the steering wheel and rehearsed every line of the encounter in his head. He didn't have to fake the tension. His pulse thundered beneath his skin. The flashing lights appeared behind him like a signal from fate. A police cruiser. Right on time. He pulled over, kept both hands visible on the wheel. The officer approached slowly, tapping on the window. License and registration. David handed them over. Is there a problem, officer? You were swerving between lanes. I wasn't aware of that, David said evenly. Step out of the vehicle. He complied, calm but deliberate. The air was cold, his breath visible. Another officer emerged from the car. One of them whispered something David couldn't quite hear. Then, just as planned, came the moment. Sir, don't reach for anything. I'm not. Hands behind your back. The cuffs clicked shut. Cold metal. Scripted control. A perfect performance of the injustice he'd watched happen too many times. As they drove him downtown, the officer in the passenger seat, Officer Daniels, didn't say a word. He didn't need to. They both knew what this was. When David was processed, his name didn't trigger any alarms. His ID had been replaced with a false one prepared by his trusted IT contact at the attorney's office. To the system, he was just another black man arrested for resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. By mid-afternoon, his arraignment was scheduled. The presiding judge, Henry Whitmore. Meanwhile, across the state capitol, the investigation that would expose Whitmore's empire of discrimination was already in motion. In a quiet federal office, Dr. Evelyn Park stood before a table stacked with graphs, audio transcripts, and court records. Beside her sat Agent Monica Reyes from the Federal Civil Rights Division and Deputy Attorney General Karen Holt. Evelyn clicked the projector remote. For 15 years, Judge Henry Whitmore has delivered harsher sentences to defendants of color, specifically black defendants, than to white defendants for the same crimes. The disparity is 42% on average. Karen frowned. 42? That's impossible. Evelyn nodded. I thought so too. I reran the analysis 4 times. It's not error, it's a pattern. Agent Reyes leaned forward. We'll need hard evidence, audio, testimony, something tangible. Evelyn opened a small silver case and pulled out a flash drive. I think I have that. A former court reporter, Maria Lopez, came to me last week. She recorded several of Whitmore's private chamber sessions. You should hear this, she pressed play. Whitmore's voice filled the room, sharp and clear. They come into my courtroom acting like victims. My father didn't fight in a war, so I could watch discipline rot out of this country. The silence that followed was suffocating. Agent Reyes finally said, That's enough to open a federal inquiry. Karen nodded. If this leaks, it'll shake the judiciary. Evelyn's phone buzzed. A new message appeared, tomorrow morning. Whitmore's courtroom. Final proof incoming. A friend of justice. She stared at the screen, her pulse spiking. It's happening, she whispered. Back in the city jail, David sat in the holding cell, his head bowed, counting the seconds. The guard at the desk kept glancing at him as if trying to place his face. Nobody recognized him. Good. At exactly 11:30 the next morning, the courtroom doors opened. The marble floor gleamed under fluorescent light. Whitmore sat high on his bench, eyes cold as winter glass. The bailiff's voice rang out, Case of State versus Daniel Carter. David stood, calm and collected. He could feel the stares, the guards, the clerks, the attorneys who whispered quietly about the confident man in the defendant's chair. Whitmore shuffled the papers. Resisting arrest. Disturbing the peace. 60 days in county jail. The words struck like hammers, but David didn't flinch. Whitmore slammed his gavel. Next case. Your Honor, David said suddenly, his voice firm. Whitmore froze. What did you just say? I'd like permission to address the court. This hearing is over. Bailiff, remove him. David's voice cut through the air like a blade. My name is David Carter, lead prosecutor for the State of North Carolina Civil Integrity Division. The room erupted, gasps, murmurs, reporters clutching their phones. The bailiff hesitated mid-step. Whitmore blinked, his face draining of color. You what? David pulled out his badge from his jacket pocket and placed it on the defense table. The gold emblem gleamed under the light. For 6 months, I've been conducting an official investigation into systemic judicial misconduct in this district. Today, you just gave me the final piece of evidence. Whitmore's hand trembled. You entrapped me. I didn't have to, David said softly. You've been showing your bias for 15 years. I simply let you do it one more time with me as your defendant. The room fell into stunned silence. Outside, the federal agents were already on their way. Inside, every reporter had their camera aimed squarely at the man who thought he'd never be caught. The fall of Judge Henry Whitmore had begun. The air inside the courtroom felt electric, alive with disbelief, fear, and something new rising between the marble walls. Justice. Judge Whitmore's fingers trembled on the gavel, but he didn't bring it down. He couldn't. The authority that had carried him for 15 years was cracking, splintering, collapsing under the weight of the truth. David Carter stood still, calm as the eye of a storm. His voice filled the silence. You sentenced me to jail for traffic violations. No criminal record, no aggression, no resistance. You saw a black man in a suit and assumed guilt. That was your mistake. Reporters leaned forward. Phones rose like a forest of recording devices. Every eye in the courtroom turned from the bench to the man who had just unmasked its master. Whitmore's throat tightened. This is outrageous. You can't just waltz in here and... David's tone sharpened, every word deliberate. I didn't waltz in, Your Honor. I was dragged in, handcuffed, humiliated, and silenced. The same way you've treated hundreds of others. The only difference today is that I came prepared. He reached into his briefcase and placed a thick folder on the table. Inside this file are 15 years of your sentences. Every one of them analyzed, compared, verified by independent statisticians. 42% longer sentences for black defendants than white defendants charged with identical crimes. A ripple of shock swept through the gallery. Attorneys exchanged uneasy glances. Court officers whispered. Even the bailiff looked frozen in place. Whitmore's face flushed crimson. That's absurd. Those numbers mean nothing without context. I agree, David said, his voice low but piercing. Context matters. So let's add some. He pressed a small recorder. Whitmore's voice echoed through the speakers, chillingly familiar. They come into my courtroom acting like victims. My father didn't fight in a war so I could watch discipline rot out of this country. The color drained from Whitmore's face. A woman in the gallery gasped. The reporter's pen scratched furiously. That recording, David continued, was made in your private chambers by your former clerk, Maria Lopez. She documented 18 months of meetings filled with statements like that, and they are now in the possession of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Whitmore lurched forward. You have no right. No, David interrupted, his voice cutting through the rising noise. You had no right. No right to strip people of their freedom because of your prejudice. No right to turn justice into a weapon. He stepped closer to the bench, unflinching. For 15 years you hid behind robes and rituals. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. The courtroom door opened quietly. The sound of heels against marble made everyone turn. Agent Monica Reyes entered, followed by 2 federal marshals and Deputy Attorney General Karen Holt. The presence of the FBI inside a state courtroom was enough to silence even the loudest whispers. Karen's voice carried calm authority. Judge Henry Whitmore, by order of the United States Department of Justice, you are hereby suspended from judicial duties pending formal investigation. The marshals stood behind him, waiting. Whitmore's lips trembled. This is a farce. I am a sitting judge. And I, David said evenly, am the lead prosecutor who exposed your crimes. Whitmore's hand reached instinctively for his gavel, but it slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a sharp crack. The sound echoed, final and hollow. For a moment, the only thing in the room was silence. Pure, suffocating silence. Agent Reyes unfolded a document. Judge Henry Whitmore, you are charged with conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights under color of law, in violation of Title 18 U.S. Code, Section 242. Whitmore's eyes widened, the reality crashing in. You don't understand. We understand perfectly, Reyes said. We've reviewed 47 hours of audio recordings, 6 months of sentencing data, and over 100 testimonies. The evidence is overwhelming. Whitmore looked out into the gallery. Every face he saw, lawyers, clerks, families, former defendants, stared back at him not with fear but with fury. For the first time, Henry Whitmore realized he was alone. David turned toward the reporters. His voice carried the calm of someone who had waited years to speak. This case is not just about one judge. It's about every courtroom that has treated justice as a privilege instead of a promise. Every person who is told to stay quiet. Every life ruined by bias hidden behind authority. A reporter shouted from the gallery, Mr. Carter, what happens to the cases Judge Whitmore ruled on? David raised his folder. Every single one of them will be reviewed by an independent panel. Defendants who were sentenced under discriminatory conditions will have their cases reopened and reviewed. Justice delayed will not remain justice denied. The marshals stepped forward. Judge Whitmore, please stand and place your hands behind your back. His voice cracked. This is persecution. I stood for order. For discipline. David met his gaze, steady and unflinching. You stood for control. You mistook power for justice, and now you'll face the same system you corrupted. The handcuffs clicked shut, sharp and final. For years, Whitmore had watched those cuffs close on others without flinching. Now the sound made him tremble. As the marshals led him away, he stopped beside David. You planned this, he whispered, his voice shaking. From the beginning, David nodded. Every second, Whitmore's eyes darkened. You'll never survive in this business. You made enemies you don't even know exist. David's reply was soft but lethal. Then I guess I'll just have to keep making more until this system stops bleeding people dry. Whitmore was escorted out through the side door. The same one countless defendants had disappeared through, except this time, the man in the robe was the one in chains. The courtroom exhaled. Reporters scribbled, cameras clicked, murmurs rose like wind through leaves. But through it all, David Carter remained still, hands folded, gaze steady on the empty bench. The bailiff retrieved the fallen gavel and placed it on the table. David looked at it for a long moment, then said quietly, "Leave it there. Some symbols are stronger when broken." 6 months passed, but the echoes of that courtroom had not faded. The story of Judge Henry Whitmore spread across the nation like wildfire. Law schools dissected it, news anchors replayed it, and people who had once been silenced found their voices again. In a glass tower overlooking the city, David Carter stood in his new office, sunlight spilling across his desk. The nameplate read Deputy Attorney General, Civil Rights Division. The same hands that had once been cuffed now signed policies that would change how justice was served across the country. He still carried the same briefcase, scratched, worn, with the faint letters DC engraved near the handle. It was a reminder of the day he'd walked into a courtroom as a defendant and walked out as a symbol of accountability. Sandra knocked softly and entered, a thick folder in her arms. "Morning, boss. The last of the review reports just came in. You might want to sit for this one." He gestured for her to continue. 437 cases, she said, setting the file down, all tied to Whitmore's courtroom. 200 already overturned. The rest under active review. Families are getting closure. David nodded, though the weight of it pressed on him. 437 lives, he murmured. "And those are just the ones we found." Sandra hesitated. "You did what no one else could." He looked out the window toward the courthouse where it all began. "No, I just did what too many people were afraid to try." His secure phone buzzed. A message from Agent Reyes lit up the screen. Federal appeal denied. Whitmore's conviction upheld. Sentence 18 years. Justice complete, David exhaled slowly. It wasn't joy that filled him. It was something quieter. Relief. He forwarded the message to Dr. Evelyn Park with a single line. "We did it." Her reply came within minutes. One judge down. Many more to go. There was no victory lap, no champagne, no applause. Just the steady rhythm of work continuing. Because the truth was, Whitmore wasn't the only one. He was just the first to fall. Later that afternoon, David walked through the courthouse halls. The marble floors still gleamed, but something about them felt different, fairer, lighter. At the far end, a new name was etched on the plaque outside courtroom 4. Judge Naomi Ellis, the youngest and first black woman appointed to replace Whitmore's seat. Inside, she was presiding over a minor sentencing hearing. Her voice was steady, her tone even, her words deliberate. "Justice," she said to the defendant, "isn't about punishment. It's about fairness. You'll serve your probation, but you'll also have the opportunity to rebuild." For a moment, David simply watched. It was the kind of courtroom he'd once imagined and stopped believing could exist. He slipped out quietly, leaving behind the sound of a gavel that no longer struck fear. That evening, the press requested an interview for the 1-year anniversary of Whitmore's arrest. David hesitated but finally agreed. The camera light blinked red as he adjusted his tie and began to speak. 6 months ago, a man who believed he was untouchable learned that the law isn't a weapon for the powerful, it's a promise to the powerless. Judge Henry Whitmore's conviction didn't just end one career. It ended a culture of silence. He paused, his gaze steady, his tone simple. Justice isn't automatic. It doesn't happen just because we have laws. It happens when people are brave enough to enforce them equally. Reporters leaned closer. "Mr. Carter, do you believe the system can truly change?" He smiled faintly. "Systems don't change, people do. And when enough people decide that wrong is no longer acceptable, that's when justice becomes real." The next morning, he sat at his desk reading the newest legal review, the Carter Protocol, a nationwide reform modeled after his investigation. 17 states had adopted it.
Federal courts were piloting it.
Every judge's sentencing record would now be analyzed for bias. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. His phone rang again. "David," said Evelyn, "the Civil Rights Board just approved your next target." Another judge. Another district. He didn't hesitate. "Send me the files." After she hung up, David stared at the courthouse through his window. The sun was sinking low, painting the city in gold. He could see people walking out, families, attorneys, defendants, faces that carried hope instead of fear. He thought of Michael, now working as a community advocate, helping those who couldn't afford legal defense. He thought of the mothers who had written to thank him, their sons free because someone had finally cared enough to count the numbers. He thought of the gavel still sitting in his office drawer, the same one that had slipped from Whitmore's hands that day. Cracked, splintered, imperfect. He lifted it, ran his thumb over the fracture, and whispered to himself, "Justice isn't blind. It just needs people who are willing to see." He placed the gavel back in the drawer and closed it gently. The world outside kept moving, the city humming with the slow rhythm of change. For the first time in years, David Carter smiled, not because the fight was over, but because it had finally begun.